So first of all, thank you to the organisers of this symposium for allowing me to contribute as someone who works not on the economics of human language, but rather on the economy and specifically the efficiency of coding in non-human primate vocal communication. And before I start, I'd also like to thank my collaborators on this project, Govindasmi Agramurti, Mina Su, Rafaela Heeson, Ramon Ferrari-Cancho, and Jacob Dunn. So all of these people have contributed very significantly to the work that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, my interest in the economy, the efficiency of coding in non-human primate vocal communication really came about through some studies that I've been doing in these systems of the common statistical patterns of language known as linguistic laws. And in particular, I've been looking at this law, Zipf's law of abbreviation. It's also known in the literature as Zipf's law of brevity. So this was put forward by the linguist George Kingsley Zipf in his 1936 book, The Psychobiology of Language. And Zipf's law of abbreviation is essentially very simple. It describes the tendency of more frequently used words to be shorter. And of course, this makes perfect sense if we think about the way we speak every day. So in English, for example, the most commonly used words are words like a, of, the, he, she, it. They're very, very short, very efficient words. It's not many times we're going to use really long words like psychoneuroendocrinology or anti-disestablishmentarianism. If these were the words we used all the time, we'd run out of time, potentially. We might run out of breath. We'd probably run out of energy to get these messages across. And at its heart, Zipf's law of abbreviation is a principle about the efficiency of coding. It's based on the economic principle of least effort. And this law has been tested in, to date, somewhere around 950 different human languages, and as far as I know, it's been found to hold in every single one. So it seems to be a true statistical, a true universal of human language. So we're interested in testing it in a non-human primate. So we looked at it in this species. This is a Formosan macaque, Macaca cyclopus. It's a monkey species endemic to Taiwan. And it's a species that has in its vocal repertoire 35 different call types. So as Zipf's law of abbreviation holds in this species, we'd expect to see a negative relationship between the mean duration of call types and the frequency with which they are given. And when we analysed our data, that's exactly what we found. So this graph shows, with each dot here representing one of the call types in the repertoire of this species, the negative relationship between, on the vertical axis, the mean duration of call types, and on the horizontal axis, the number of each call type that were recorded, so a measure of frequency of use. And what we can see is a pattern very similar to language, so the most frequently used call types tend to be very short. It isn't very often that the longest call types in the repertoire are given. And very strikingly, there are no call types in the repertoire of this species that are both long in duration and frequently given. So what this shows is that Zipf's law of abbreviation holds beyond our own species, and it suggests there's selection for efficiency of coding in the vocal communication system of this macaque species. And in a subsequent paper, we were then able to demonstrate mathematically that this efficiency of coding comes about because Zipf's law of abbreviation reflects compression, the information theoretic principle of minimizing the expected length of a code, compression providing efficiency of coding within any communication or information system. Now, shortly after our macaque paper came out, actually while it was still in press, this paper was published in the same journal. And in this paper, they studied two other non-human primate species, the common marmoset and the golden-backed wackery, and found no agreement at all with Zipf's law of abbreviation, which was very interesting to us because this law seems to be an absolute universal in human language, and at least based on these two studies, it doesn't seem to be universal across the other primates. So what we decided to do was then to look to the literature to try and find out if we could glean data that would allow us to test this across lots and lots of different species, to try and see the pattern that would emerge in terms of agreement with or lack of agreement with this particular law. So the way we did that was we went back to the literature, we did very comprehensive literature searching to try and identify those papers that would allow us to replicate the analysis we'd done with the Formosan macaques. So basically what we needed were papers that described the full vocal repertoire of the species, that gave the mean duration for each call type within that repertoire, and the measure of the frequency of use of each of those call types. And in the end, we were able to identify papers for 28 different primate species that met these criteria. And these species cover quite a diversity of the extant primates. So this is just a dozen out of our data set of 28 to give you an idea of the sort of range of species that we're talking about. And they're diverse in a number of different dimensions. So, for example, we have in this data set some diurnal, highly gregarious species. These are golden snub-nosed monkeys living in groups of 200 or more. We have some nocturnal, solitary species like the ii. We have variation across species in terms of body size. The Senegalese galago weighing in at about 200 grams, so very, very small. And we have data from mountain gorillas where adult males weigh nearly 200 kilograms. And we also have variation in our data set in terms of the geographical location of these species. So we have species from across the sort of the primate range, pied tamarins from South America, ring-tailed lemurs from Madagascar, geladas from Africa, long-tailed macaques from Asia. So within this data set, we've captured a broad diversity of the extant primates. And with these data, we're able to ask questions at two different levels. First of all, at the level of individual species, to test whether there's evidence for the action of compression, whether there's evidence for efficiency of coding for each individual species, and then more broadly across the primate order. So looking at the individual species level first, our question is, do the vocal repertoires of these 28 species follow Zipf's law of abbreviation? And what we found was that some of them did, but by far the majority did not. So mean call type duration was significantly negatively related to frequency of use for 6 out of our 28 species. So this law might be a true universal of human languages. It's certainly not a true universal of primate vocal systems. Having said that, 6 out of 28 is more than you'd expect by chance. And just to show you which species we found, this law, so this is just a tree of the species in our data set. These are the 6 species, and I put this up just to make one point, which is what we're not seeing is agreement with this law in a small subset of closely related species. In fact, we find conformity to this law in, from the top, a lemur species, a New World monkey, a great ape, and then 3 Old World monkeys. Now, a very important point to make at this stage is that not conforming to this law does not mean that compression hasn't acted on these vocal systems. It doesn't mean there hasn't been pressure driving efficiency in vocal repertoires. It could be the case, for example, that compression has acted, but not sufficiently strongly to bring about the alignment of frequency of use and duration that you'd need to produce a significant negative relationship, and hence agreement with Zipf's law of abbreviation. Alternatively, or in addition, it could be that compression has acted to drive efficiency, but has been counteracted or counterbalanced by separate pressure pushing in the other direction. So, for example, a pressure to increase the likely success of information transmission, for example, in a very noisy physical environment. So what we wanted to do in the next stage was kind of move away from this very blunt 1-0 type analysis to ask whether there's evidence for the action of compression across these species' vocal repertoires. Now, in order to do that, we can't use this kind of very simple, do they agree with this law or not? We need to develop a new method to allow us to look in a more sort of nuanced way across this data set for evidence of the action of compression. And what we decided to do was to use a measure known as mean code length, which is L, to test for evidence of compression. So this is how we calculate mean code length. It's the sum from I to n of pi ei. So n is the number of elements within the repertoire, so it's the number of call types. Pi is the normalized frequency of the ith most probable element in the repertoire, and ei is the magnitude of that element. So in our data set, n is just the size of the repertoire. P is calculated as the normalized probability. So basically we take the frequency of occurrence and then normalize that such that it's a probability adding up in total to 1 across all the call types. And E in our data set is call type duration. So for each species, we're able to calculate mean code length. Then what we do is we calculate a control of that, L prime, which is defined as here where pi is a permutation function. So it's actually very simple how you do this. We have data on frequency of occurrence. We have data on duration. We've used those to calculate L. We then randomize the data on duration, recalculate L, randomize them again, recalculate L. We do that 10,000 times to give us a distribution of the possible values of L given the data that we have for that particular species. So to show that graphically, we have a distribution of L prime from this permutation test. It's a normal distribution, as you'd expect from a randomization procedure. And then onto that distribution, we're able to map, first of all, L, our observed mean code length. And we're then able to also calculate the mean of that distribution of possible code lengths given our data. And having calculated these two values, what we can then do is ask whether across species there's a tendency for L, the observed code length, to be smaller than the mean of the distribution of L prime. And asking that question is basically asking the question, is there evidence for the action of compression across species vocal repertoires? Now, the analysis here is a little bit unusual in that what we have is 2 values per species across 28 species. It's a matched pairs type analysis, but each pair is not independent of the others because they have shared evolutionary history, so some species are more closely related than others, so you need to control for that when you're doing this matched pairs type analysis. And you do that with a test called the phylogenetic paired t-test, and when we ran that, what we found was there was indeed support for the evidence of the action of compression across these repertoires. What we found was that L was smaller than the mean of the distribution of L prime for 28 of our 21 species, and the phylogenetic paired t-test suggested that was significant. So just to finish up, I'd just like to say a few words about kind of where we are at the moment and where we're going to go next with this, so ongoing and future work. What our analyses that I've presented today seem to show is that compression does seem to be an important force shaping the economy and the efficiency of coding across primate vocal repertoires. But the individual species analysis suggests that some species repertoires are very efficient. There's a very close alignment between duration and frequency of use. Other species repertoires are less efficient or potentially quite inefficient. So the next step for us is going to be trying to explain that between species variation and communicative efficiency. Why do we see such variation? Why do we get some species that show very close agreement with Zipf's law of abbreviation, very small mean code lengths compared to what you might predict by chance, whereas in other species they're very far from this tight pattern? And the approach we're going to take is based on the one I've already showed you. So for each species, we can calculate our code length, L, the distribution of possible code lengths, L prime. And from this, we're going to derive a single index that captures the overall efficiency of the coding system. What we think we're going to do is a combination of L, the observed mean code length, the mean of that distribution, and the minimum possible value. That seems to be the thing that's making sense at the moment. We're still working on this, it's very much work in progress. But once we've derived that value, we'll have one variable that captures the efficiency of coding for each species, and then we're going to use that variable to test hypotheses about the social and ecological parameters that may be driving this between species variation in the efficiency and the economy of coding in their vocal communication systems. Thank you very much for your attention.